I'm 81 years old now, and I have a confession that surprises people more than it should. The happiest years of my life didn't begin when I finally had enough money. They didn't begin when my children were grown. They didn't begin when I retired. They began the day I stopped trying to be interesting. That sounds strange, doesn't it? When we're young, we're told to build a life worth talking about. We collect accomplishments, stories, invitations, photographs, titles, and memories we hope someone else will admire. We learn to answer the question, "What do you do?" Long before we learn to answer, "Who are you when nobody is looking?" For most of my life, I thought those two questions had the same answer. I was wrong. People sometimes ask me if getting older is lonely. I smile when they ask because I understand why they think that. They picture an old woman in a quiet house, moving a little slower than she used to, with more birthdays behind her than ahead. They imagine silence as something empty. I don't. Silence has become one of the kindest friends I've ever had. Not because I dislike people, not because life disappointed me, and certainly not because I've stopped caring. It's because somewhere between all the decades of trying to become someone worth remembering, I quietly discovered that the ordinary parts of life were the ones I'd been missing all along. I wasn't born knowing that. In fact, if you had met me 40 or 50 years ago, you probably would have described me as energetic before you described me as calm, busy before thoughtful, capable before content. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. At least that's what I told myself. I simply believed life should always be moving forward, always growing, always becoming. If I finished one goal, I immediately started another. If I mastered one skill, I searched for something else to learn. There was always another mountain somewhere in the distance. Looking back now, I don't think I ever paused long enough to admire the view from the one I had already climbed. That's one of the odd things about aging. You don't always gain wisdom because the years pass. Sometimes you gain wisdom because, eventually, you're too tired to keep running from yourself. My name is Margaret. I'm 81 years old. For 34 years, I worked as an elementary school librarian. Now, I know some people hear that and imagine a woman quietly putting books back on shelves all day. I wish it had been that peaceful. A school library isn't only filled with books. It's filled with frightened children on their first day of school. It's filled with curious minds asking impossible questions. It's filled with teachers who need one more favor before lunch. It's filled with parents who want reassurance. It's filled with constant movement. Every day someone needed something. A book, a listening ear, a recommendation, a quiet place to settle down. I loved every bit of it. Children have a beautiful way of reminding you that wonder doesn't disappear. Adults simply stop noticing it. If a child found a ladybug on the playground, it became the biggest discovery in the world. If the first snow arrived, every window suddenly became more interesting than every lesson. If they learned one astonishing fact about whales or planets or butterflies, they couldn't wait to tell someone. I admired that. Somewhere along the way, though, I stopped noticing my own sense of wonder. Without realizing it, I became the dependable one, the reliable one, the woman who always had an answer, the one who remembered birthdays, the one who organized things, the one people called because they knew I would say yes. At work, that reputation followed me. Outside of work, it followed me too. Neighbors knew I'd volunteer. Friends assumed I'd help. Community groups remembered my number. Family members often started conversations with, "Could you?" None of it happened because people were cruel. Most of them were good people. They simply trusted that I'd be there. The truth is, I trusted that version of myself too. It felt comforting to be needed. There is a certain warmth that comes from believing you've made yourself useful in the world. It's a lovely feeling, until usefulness quietly becomes your identity. I didn't notice when that happened. Changes like that almost never arrive with an announcement. They settle into your life, one ordinary afternoon at a time. One extra responsibility. One small favor. One committee. One phone call. One promise. Then another. Then another. Years pass, and what once felt like generosity begins to feel like gravity. Everything naturally falls toward you. You become the person everyone assumes can carry a little more. If I'm honest, I rarely questioned it. Why would I? People appreciated me. They thanked me. They smiled when they saw me. I had a career I loved, a calendar that stayed full, and enough conversations every week to convince myself I was living a meaningful life. From the outside, everything looked exactly as I had hoped it would. Looking back now, I can see that I spent decades measuring my life by movement. If the days were busy, I assumed they were important. If people needed me, I assumed I mattered. If my schedule overflowed, I assumed I was living well. At the time, I never thought to ask a different question. Not, am I accomplishing enough? Not, am I helping enough? But something much quieter. Am I actually here for my own life? That question wouldn't arrive until much later. At this point in my story, I was still convinced that becoming more useful, more accomplished, and more memorable was exactly what a good life was supposed to look like, and I lived that way for a very long time. The strange thing about living that way is that nothing feels wrong at first. Quite the opposite. People smile when they see you. They thank you. They tell you they couldn't have done it without you. Those words settle into your heart like little rewards. You begin believing that being dependable is the highest version of love. For years, I believed exactly that. Retirement didn't change me overnight. It simply removed the schedule that had been carrying me forward for decades. The first Monday after I retired, I woke up before sunrise without an alarm. I made coffee out of habit and glanced at the clock, already calculating what should have been happening. Children would be walking into school. Teachers would be unlocking classrooms. Someone would probably be looking for a book that had been misplaced. Someone else would have forgotten an assignment. For 34 years, my mornings had belonged to that rhythm. Suddenly, they belonged to no one. I remember standing in my kitchen holding a warm mug with nowhere I needed to be. At first, I called it freedom. A week later, it started to feel unfamiliar. People imagine retirement as one long vacation. Perhaps it is for some. For me, it was more like walking out of a room where music had been playing for decades and discovering just how quiet the world could be. I filled the silence the only way I knew how. I volunteered at the local literacy center. I joined a historical society. I offered to organize neighborhood events. When someone mentioned they needed help, my hand went up almost automatically. Old habits rarely ask permission before following us into new seasons of life. One afternoon, I laughed at myself because I'd somehow become secretary for 2 different volunteer groups without remembering when I'd agreed. That should have told me something. Instead, I thought, well, at least I'm staying useful. Useful. That word followed me everywhere. It sounded noble, responsible, even comforting. But it quietly became the ruler I measured myself against. If a week passed without someone asking for my help, I felt oddly restless. Had I become forgettable? Was I no longer contributing? Those questions embarrassed me. After all, I had worked hard my entire life. I wasn't seeking attention, or so I believed. The truth was more complicated. I wasn't chasing applause. I was chasing reassurance. There is a difference. Applause asks strangers to notice you. Reassurance asks the people around you to remind you that you still matter. Looking back now, I don't judge that younger version of myself. She wasn't selfish. She wasn't vain. She was simply afraid of becoming invisible. Age has a curious way of introducing that fear. Not all at once, little by little. You notice that younger people finish your sentences. You realize stores play music you've never heard before. You attend more retirement parties than weddings. The world keeps moving exactly as it should, but every so often you feel as though you've stepped half a pace behind it. I think that's why so many of us cling to being needed. It gives us proof that we still occupy an important place in someone else's life. During those first few years after retirement, my calendar was still surprisingly full. Lunch with former coworkers, volunteer meetings, church committees, helping neighbors sort donations, watching grandchildren after school whenever schedules became difficult. If someone had looked at my planner, they would have said I was living a wonderfully active retirement. Perhaps I was, but something small kept happening. Whenever I returned home after another busy day, I'd sit in my favorite chair by the living room window. The house would become perfectly still. I'd hear the refrigerator humming softly. Sometimes the wind would move the branches outside just enough to brush against the glass. And almost every evening, I'd ask myself the same quiet question. What did I enjoy today? Not what I accomplished. Not who appreciated me. Not what I crossed off a list. What did I actually enjoy? Some evenings I couldn't answer. That realization unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. How could someone spend an entire day doing worthwhile things and still struggle to remember a single moment that truly belonged to herself? I tried dismissing the feeling. I told myself everyone needs time to adjust after retirement. I reminded myself how fortunate I was. Good health, a comfortable home, people who loved me. So why did I feel as though something important had quietly slipped through my fingers? I couldn't explain it. There wasn't one dramatic event. No argument, no betrayal, no great disappointment. Only an increasingly uncomfortable feeling that my days were full, while my spirit remained strangely untouched. One Saturday morning, I walked through the farmer's market, carrying an empty canvas bag. The place was full of laughter, music drifting from a young man playing guitar, children asking for fresh peaches, neighbors greeting one another. I noticed everyone seemed wonderfully alive. Yet I was moving through the crowd thinking about errands, milk, bread, laundry detergent, a birthday card I needed to mail. Even surrounded by beauty, my mind was occupied with obligations. I stopped beside a flower stand without intending to buy anything. A little girl, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, was staring at a bucket of bright yellow sunflowers. She wasn't talking. She wasn't asking for one. She was simply looking at them with complete delight, as though she'd discovered treasure. Her grandmother smiled and waited patiently. No one hurried her. No one checked the time. For reasons I still can't fully explain, I stood there watching that child longer than I watched the flowers. I realized she wasn't trying to make the morning productive. She wasn't trying to make it memorable. She was simply allowing herself to experience it. I carried that image home with me, not because it changed my life that day. It didn't. Real change almost never happens that quickly, but it left behind a question that refused to disappear. When had I stopped experiencing my own life and started managing it instead? That question stayed with me longer than I expected, not because it demanded an answer, because it quietly followed me through ordinary days. I'd be folding laundry and suddenly think about it. I'd be watering the tomatoes behind my little house and hear it again. I'd finish another volunteer meeting drive home, turn off the engine, and sit in the silence for a moment before getting out of the car. When did I stop experiencing my own life and start managing it instead? I wish I could tell you there was one unforgettable day that changed everything. There wasn't. Life rarely unfolds that way. More often, it speaks in whispers long before it ever raises its voice. One autumn afternoon, I opened a closet in the hallway because I was looking for a flashlight. Instead, I found 3 cardboard boxes I hadn't touched in years. They were filled with old notebooks, not journals, lists. Lists of committee meetings, lists of books to order, lists of birthdays, shopping lists, volunteer schedules, holiday plan, phone numbers written on scraps of paper. Reminder after reminder after reminder. I sat on the floor, flipping through pages that represented decades of my life. There wasn't a single drawing, not one poem, no thoughts about what had made me laugh that week, no record of a beautiful sunset, no page that simply said, "Today I felt happy." Page after page documented what needed to be done. Very little recorded who I had been while doing it. That surprised me. I had always believed I was preserving my life. Instead, I had mostly archived my responsibilities. I carried one notebook into the living room and spent nearly an hour turning pages. The handwriting changed over the years. Some pages were written by a younger woman who rushed through everything. Later pages were steadier, softer. But every version of me seemed to be hurrying toward the next obligation. It made me wonder whether I'd mistaken productivity for purpose. The next week, I met an old colleague for lunch. We hadn't seen each other in several years. We hugged, laughed about how much older we both looked, and spent the first half hour remembering people from the school. Then she smiled and said something she meant as a compliment. "You were always the busiest person I knew." I laughed politely, but those words echoed strangely inside me. Was that really how I would be remembered? Busy, not kind, not joyful, not curious, not peaceful. Busy. She wasn't wrong. I had been busy. In fact, I had become so skilled at staying occupied that I hardly noticed when I was exhausted. That afternoon, I drove home with the windows open. The weather was beautiful. Leaves drifted lazily across the road. People were walking dogs. Children were riding bicycles. Everything looked wonderfully alive. Yet my mind kept returning to a single word: busy. For several days afterward, I paid closer attention to myself than I ever had before. Not in a critical way, just with curiosity. I noticed how quickly I reached for my calendar before asking myself what I actually wanted to do. I noticed that if someone called asking for help, my answer formed before I'd even considered my own plans. I noticed how uncomfortable empty hours made me feel. That surprised me the most. An afternoon with nothing scheduled should have felt like a gift. Instead, it made me restless. As though I needed permission simply to exist. One rainy Tuesday, I brewed a pot of tea and carried it onto the covered porch. Rain tapped gently against the roof, while the garden drank quietly below. I had nowhere to be. No errands. No appointments. No responsibilities until the next day. It should have been a peaceful afternoon. Instead, I found myself mentally creating tasks. Maybe I should reorganize the pantry. Maybe I should answer emails. Maybe I should call someone. Maybe I should. Then I stopped. Not because I had discovered some great truth, because I was tired, deeply tired. Not physically. I knew that kind of tiredness well enough. This was different. It felt like the exhaustion that comes from constantly asking yourself to justify your own existence, as though every hour needed proof that it had been useful. I looked across the yard where rainwater collected in tiny puddles. A robin landed beside one of them, dipped its head for a drink, fluttered its wings, and flew away. The entire moment lasted only a few seconds. No audience, no accomplishment. Nothing anyone else would ever remember. Yet somehow it felt complete. I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd allowed myself to enjoy something so small without immediately thinking about what came next. That realization unsettled me. Not because I'd wasted my life. I don't believe I had. I had loved my work. I had loved helping people. I had loved building a life that mattered. But somewhere along the way, I had quietly started believing that my value depended on remaining in motion, as though stopping meant disappearing, as though rest needed to be earned, as though simply being Margaret was somehow less meaningful than being useful Margaret. That thought lingered with me for days. It didn't accuse me. It simply waited, patiently, like a question that knew its answer would arrive only when I was finally ready to hear it. A few mornings later, the telephone rang while I was reading. It wasn't an important book. Not one of the classics I'd always promised myself I'd finish someday. It was simply a novel I'd picked up at the library because the first page made me smile. The kettle had just finished whistling. Sunlight was stretching across the living room floor, warming the old rug that had faded near the windows over the years. The phone rang once, then again. Without thinking, I reached for it. My hand stopped halfway. Not because I had made some grand decision, not because I wanted to ignore whoever was calling. I simply realized I didn't have to answer immediately. That thought felt almost unfamiliar. For more than half a century, I'd treated every ringing telephone, every knock at the door, every request for help as though it deserved instant attention, as though my own moment could always wait. I lowered my hand. I poured my tea instead. I sat back down in my chair. The phone stopped ringing. The room became quiet again. For the first minute, I felt guilty. Not overwhelming guilt, just the small, persistent kind that whispers you've forgotten to do something important. I kept expecting another call, or a message marked urgent, or that uneasy feeling people sometimes describe when they know they've disappointed someone. None of it came. After I finished my tea, I checked my voicemail. A neighbor had called to ask if I knew the name of a plumber I'd used several years earlier. It wasn't an emergency. She even ended the message by saying, "Whenever you have time." Whenever you have time. I listened to those words twice. They sounded so ordinary. Yet I realized something surprising. The pressure hadn't come from her. It had come from me. Somewhere over the years, I had quietly rewritten every request into an obligation. Nobody had asked me to abandon my own morning. I had volunteered it without even noticing. That afternoon, I returned the call. We talked for a few minutes. I gave her the number she needed. She thanked me warmly, wished me a pleasant day, and that was the end of it. Nothing had been damaged by waiting. No friendship had been weakened. No crisis had unfolded. Life had simply continued. Over the next several weeks, I began making tiny changes, not dramatic ones, the sort of changes another person might never notice. If I was halfway through lunch, I finished eating before answering the phone. If I was enjoying a walk, I didn't rush home because I remembered another task I could probably squeeze into the afternoon. Sometimes I sat on the porch after dinner and watched the sky change colors without feeling the need to accomplish one more thing before bedtime. Those moments seemed almost insignificant, but together they began reshaping my days. Something else changed, too. I stopped apologizing quite so much. I hadn't realized how often I said, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry I can't make it. I'm sorry I'm busy. I'm sorry. I just need a quiet day." Eventually, those words became simpler. I won't be able to. I already have plans. I'd love to another time. The interesting part was that most people accepted those answers without hesitation. The long explanations had never been for them. They had been for me. I had been trying to convince myself that it was acceptable to have limits. One Saturday morning, I drove to a nearby botanical garden I'd somehow never visited, despite living only half an hour away. There wasn't an event, no guided tour, no schedule, just winding paths, flowering trees, and people strolling at whatever pace felt comfortable. I wandered without a map. Every so often I stopped simply because something caught my eye. A cluster of white blossoms moving gently in the breeze. An elderly couple sitting silently on a bench, sharing nothing more than the sunshine. A dragonfly balancing on the edge of a pond. For years, I might have hurried past each of those moments on my way towards something more productive. That day, they were the destination. As I walked back toward my car, I found myself smiling for no particular reason. Not because life had suddenly become perfect. It hadn't. My knees still ached on damp mornings. Friends still faced illnesses. Some chairs at my dining table would always remain empty. Age had not spared me from loss, but it had quietly offered me something else: permission. Permission to stop measuring the value of a day by how many people I pleased. Permission to leave a few hours completely unclaimed. Permission to discover that an ordinary afternoon could be enough. When I arrived home, I unlocked the front door, stepped inside, and stood for a moment in the familiar silence. It no longer felt like something waiting to be filled. It felt like something welcoming me home. For the first time in many years, I had the unmistakable feeling that my life was no longer happening around me. I was finally living inside it. These days, people sometimes ask me if I ever miss the woman I used to be. The one who always had a full calendar. The one who never seemed to sit still. The one everyone could count on. I usually smile before I answer, because the truth is, I don't miss her. I feel tenderness toward her. She did the best she could with what she believed. She believed that a meaningful life was something you built by constantly proving your value. She believed there was always one more thing to accomplish, one more person to help, one more responsibility that couldn't wait until tomorrow. She wasn't wrong because she cared too much. She was simply living under a definition of success that left very little room for herself. If I could sit beside that younger Margaret for just a few minutes, I don't think I'd give her advice. Age has taught me that advice rarely changes a person's heart. Experience does. Instead, I think I'd pour us each a cup of tea. We'd sit quietly. Eventually, she'd begin telling me about everything she still needed to finish. I'd let her speak. Then I'd ask only one question. When was the last time you enjoyed an ordinary day without trying to make it useful? I imagined she'd have to think about that for a while. Maybe that's why growing older has surprised me more than anything else. I expected weaker knees. I expected silver hair. I expected to lose some things along the way. I never expected to discover how much beauty had been waiting inside ordinary moments all along. These days, I notice things I once hurried past. The first cool breeze after a hot afternoon. The smell of rain drifting through an open window. The way morning light slowly reaches every corner of my living room before I even finish my first cup of tea. None of those moments would have impressed the younger version of me. She would have already been halfway through her list for the day. I don't blame her. She was trying to build a good life. I simply understand now that a good life doesn't always announce itself through extraordinary moments. Sometimes it arrives quietly, disguised as an unhurried morning, a peaceful walk, or an afternoon with nothing that needs fixing. I still help people. I still care deeply about the people in my life. That part of me never disappeared. The difference is that kindness no longer begins with forgetting myself. It begins by remembering that I, too, belong among the people worthy of patience. That may sound like a small change. For me, it changed everything. When I look around my home now, I don't see a place waiting for the next responsibility. I see a place where my life is happening, a place where I can laugh, read, think, rest, welcome someone when it feels right, or simply enjoy my own company without wondering whether I should be doing something else instead. At 81, I've stopped trying to become someone more impressive than the woman I already am. I've stopped believing every day has to be remarkable in order to matter. And perhaps that's the quiet gift these later years have given me. Not certainty, not perfection. Just enough perspective to understand that a peaceful life is rarely built all at once. It's built in small choices. One slow morning, one honest no, one unhurried afternoon, one ordinary moment that you finally allow yourself to fully live. If there's one thing these 81 years have gently taught me, it's this. Our lives are not measured only by what we accomplish. They're also measured by whether we were truly present for the days we were given. Tonight, when the sun slips behind the trees outside my window, I'll probably make another cup of tea. I'll sit in the same comfortable chair I've grown so fond of. The house will be quiet. The world will keep moving without asking anything of me for a little while, and for the first time in my life, that quiet won't feel like something missing. It will feel exactly like enough. Thank you for spending these moments with me. If this reflection meant something to you, please leave a comment below and subscribe if you'd like to join me for more stories about growing older with wisdom, perspective, and peace.